So good afternoon, everybody. The last presentation standing between you and lunch, always a great spot. So as introduced, my name is Ruth Mhlanga. I'm a private sector policy advisor for Oxfam GB. I'm just going to run through a couple of, quite a lot of slides actually, talking about a paper that we recently published in February. It's available outside if you'd like to know more about it, but it's also available online. So a lot of people will know that Oxfam is a humanitarian organization. It's an international development organization. But what most people don't actually know is that Oxfam has quite a lot of engagement with the private sector, and Oxfam itself is a private sector actor in some respects. So for those of you who live in the UK, you'll notice Oxfam shops that are trading on a number of high streets across the country. But in addition to that, we run enterprise development programs in a number of different countries. But then we work with private sector actors such as Unilever, Marks and Spencer's, and then we also have campaigns. Some of you may have seen our work with Behind the Brands, as well as publishing different reports around private sector issues. And the team that I sit in works right across all of these areas. So much of what I'll be talking about today draws on this experience of ourselves being a private sector actor, but also engaging with a number of different actors. The other aspect of Oxfam, which again tends to be quite hidden, is around the research and the publications that we do. With our work in countries, whether it's humanitarian or whether it's development, we draw on those learnings and we use them to try and inform our policy asks to various governments. So you'll see there we've got a report on Behind the Brands, which is around Journey to Sustainable Food. And this is what we use to engage with the companies when we were talking about how the 10 biggest brands, which is Unilever, Pepsi, Mars, Mondelez, how they can change their behavior to allow smallholder farmers to thrive. So the SDGs, which we've been hearing a little about today, in terms of setting the context, they're a lot more comprehensive than their predecessors, which were the MDGs. So we've got 17 goals, 169 indicators, and they cover quite a breadth. I think even within that, there are a number of issues which are still left out. But what is interesting about the SDGs this time around is that they have assumed a role for the private sector, and I assume many people in this room would consider themselves part of the private sector, that was not there before within the MDGs. There was almost an explicit call to the private sector to say, we would like you to get involved this time. And you'll see there a quote from Ban Ki-moon. I apologize to the guys at the back. I don't think that green font is particularly helpful. But essentially, the private sector has been elevated almost to the role of a nation state within the SDGs. Now, this comes with an opportunity for many people who traditionally wouldn't have gotten involved in development issues to get involved, but it comes with a challenge because there are many aspects of the private sector which need changing before they can contribute constructively to the SDG agenda. So just to note that when I say private sector, I'm talking broadly about everybody that is non-profit, but we recognize that private sector is a catch-all phrase for a lot of things, that different actors will act differently. I think even in this room, you'll have publishers of varying size, and in terms of your business model, it will behave differently with different actors. But in terms of this presentation and how I'll be talking, I'm using private sector as a sort of a catch-all phrase. And just to note, there aren't any silver bullet solutions, but part of what we're proposing is a change in the way people approach the problems in order to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. So in terms of how we think companies should be engaging with this, there's 6 key things: prioritizing impact, aligning core business, working towards systemic change, accountability and transparency, financing the goals, and understanding the role that your company plays with the government and with peers. So just diving straight into the first one, understanding impact. One of the key challenges with the SDGs has been often the problem is not properly defined before diving into it. The previous speakers have talked about some of the challenges that are being faced, particularly with women and unpaid care work. Now, when I talk to a lot of companies about gender, they say, well, no, we definitely employ women, and yes, we're working towards them earning equal pay. And then you asked about unpaid care work, and you say, well, have you catered for the fact that vast majority of women find it difficult to work the extra hours that might earn you a promotion because she has to go home and do the laundry and feed the kids and clean the house and still get back to work and still do everything else that her male colleague was supposed to do, but doesn't have to do all of those other things? Have we looked at how our impact might be exacerbating inequality? So SDG 10 about reduced inequalities between countries and within countries. So if you have access to research in the UK simply because you've got an oxfam.org, .org.uk email address, what does that mean if you're sitting perhaps in Tanzania and you don't have access to that? Again, that's exacerbating inequalities between countries, but also within countries, because again, if you're a researcher in Tanzania and you're working at a university, you might have access to that research. But if you're a smallholder farmer who actually needs access to that information, you don't. So the impact might be quite obvious. It might be, sort of sitting right in front of you, but sometimes that impact is across the other SDGs. For publishers and researchers, it might be worthwhile thinking, well, we've got obviously an impact on SDG around education, but what about your impact around inequalities, either that gender inequalities in 5 or reduced inequalities in 10, but perhaps also on sustainability. Servers and IT costs and IT carbon emissions are 4th behind the energy sector, transport sector, and the agriculture sector, which is why many of the big IT companies are trying to move towards renewable energy, because that's a massive drain in terms of carbon emissions. So again, trying to think about where is the impact that we're having as a company or as a group of people, and trying to figure out how we can better remove that before moving on to working on the goals. So this is a bit more about understanding that impact. One of the key examples that we've used is in the 1980s, a cocoa farmer used to get 16% of the value of a chocolate bar. Today, they earn 6% of the value of a chocolate bar. Now, in that time, it means somebody somewhere has been squeezing the value that they get. So again, the question to you is, within your value chain, with all the different actors, whether it's the researchers, whether it's the librarians or the publishers, who is extracting the most value from that value chain? And are we ensuring that we're able to have money flowing through it? Because again, this is one of the biggest contributors to inequality, where we find that the people who grow our food can't actually afford to buy a chocolate bar. There was one of the most bizarre situations that kicked off fair trade chocolate, which was the women who were growing the cocoa that went into the Mars, Nestle, and all the chocolate bars that we have, had never in their lives had a chocolate bar because they could not afford it. And so, again, understanding where is your impact, where are you extracting value, and is that value being shared equally right across your operations and value chain? So some of the tools that can help understanding impact is like the poverty footprint. The SDG Compass have got a couple of tools that can help companies assess where is our impact, how are we impacting on the different goals. Oxfam has got a tool around human rights assessments as well that can help a company begin to understand where is it that we're having our impact. As I said, some of it is quite obvious, but some of it can be quite hidden. So getting down to core business. This is the one that's possibly quite a challenge for a number of companies, because they've always seen the SDGs as external to themselves, or the development as external to what they do on a day-to-day basis. So one of the examples that we've used somewhat unfairly to the extractive sector is where you have an extractive sector company donating a clinic to the community in which it operates in and saying, yay, we've contributed to the health SDG. Now that's great, because that community does not have access to healthcare, but you'll find that that same extractive company, its tax evasion is equivalent to the health budget of that country. So in terms of us contributing to where they need to do the most, they weren't looking at core business, and they weren't looking at how they could actively contribute to the SDGs. So looking at, again, at operations, is there a living wage throughout the operations? Is there equal pay throughout the operations? and not just between men and women, but between different countries. Again, working towards systemic change and looking beyond single interventions. If we look at some of the work that we've done with Unilever, where they made an absolute stellar effort at changing some of their behavior in a factory in Vietnam, and they went above and beyond most companies in terms of changing the gender dynamics, in terms of how people were paid, and they took people into their supply chain. The challenge was there's a problem around collective bargaining, and a lot of the issues were systemic, and they weren't recognizing that put them at a competitive disadvantage to their peers who could do all the wrong things and then undercut them on price. So what we ended up doing was having to tell them, you need to be looking at systemic change. You need to look at how the environment around you is actually driving many of these things. So coming back to the issue of women, if you are only looking at merely the number of women that you employ, you haven't got it right. You need to look at, are women in leadership positions? How is unpaid care work having an impact in terms of the way women are able to rise up in the organization? We've got some companies and some business models are starting to change, and I think this is something that's come out quite a bit today around business models. There's often a thought that business models are static. This is the way we've always done things, and therefore we will continue to do this. And most business models are extractive. They take more from society than they give back to it. And so some of these here that you see, like Divine Chocolate, like the ones that have got the fair trade mark, like John Lewis, what they're trying to do is change that, change the governance structure. So who makes decisions? With John Lewis, they got more and more workers being part of the conversation. That way, when decisions are made, it is not extractive, and it is not seeing employees merely as an asset or as a resource. Divine Chocolate has put the women farmers at the center of decision making and as shareholders. So when profits are made, when you buy Divine Chocolate, you know the money's actually going back to the women who grew the cocoa for that chocolate bar to be made. And again, looking at the sector that you're in, who is deriving the most profit from the activities that are happening, and who is involved in making those decisions is one of the key questions that you need to ask. So just looking at accountability and transparency, this is again, I think came up a little bit earlier around research enables us to hold people to account. It enables us to understand who can make decisions. So in terms of who has access to this information, if you're a smallholder farmer and there's research that is showing the link between climate impacts and the need to change growing seasons, if that information is not readily available to you, how can you change behavior? More importantly, how can you then analyze the government's climate impact plan if you are unable to understand some of that research? So on accountability and transparency, the availability of information is absolutely crucial. Speaking to groups of investors, they've often said, we would like to put money in those programs that are doing the most for developing countries. But there's absolutely no way to benchmark different companies and how they're behaving on the SDGs. And so again, there is need for a consortium of information that is benchmarked or standardized and comparable across different sectors, so people can actually understand what does good look like, what does contributing to the SDGs look like. And again, coming back to the issue of the information must be accessible to all stakeholders, it needs to be available in a form and in a language that people can interact with. Some of the most bizarre situations that we've seen is where a sustainability report is in English and the company operates in maybe one English-speaking country. And you ask, well, what good was that going to do if nobody can understand it or read it? More to the point, does it necessarily always need to be in the sort of encyclopedic big book? Is there a way to put that information into pictures, into videos, in a way that people can find it more accessible and draw out the information they need to do? Going back also to the issue of inequality, while most countries within Africa particularly have leapfrogged and a lot of people have mobile phones and that's how they access the internet, we know the vast majority of times the mobile phone in the household is controlled by the man. Therefore, you're already eliminating women from having access to that information simply because they don't have access to the tools with which they would access that information. I think it's already come up around internet availability in different countries. I know that every time I go home to Zimbabwe, one of my frustrations is the lack of high-speed broadband. I got so used to it having here that I go home and I think, why is it so slow? So again, these are some of the issues around making information available to all stakeholders and not only decision makers, because if the only people that have information are actors such as government actors, who's to hold them account? The journalists, the people on the ground, and sort of other civil society actors. In terms of behind the brands, this is how we use accountability and information. So we did a lot of background research, but condensed it down to these indicators where we were measuring the companies. And you'll see where we started off in 2013, none of the companies were doing particularly well on any of the factors. So that's what the sort of purple, orange, red blocks mean. But as you move to 2016, you can see that there's now a lot more green on that. And what this allowed us to do was not only to be transparent with the companies, but to be transparent with the public about how we were measuring these companies, on what we were measuring them about. And so that it was very clear to everybody that this is the information that we're drawing on, and this is how we're relating back that information. And the companies appreciated this. Well, they told us quietly, not publicly, that they appreciated the fact that they were then able to see some of this. I mentioned our work with Unilever. There was quite a lot that they were unable to see, but through working with NGO actors, they were then able to get that information. This one, I know a lot of one of the things that keeps coming up today is around the cost of information and subscription costs and other things. And depending on who you're talking to in the day of the week, the figure in terms of financing the goals seems to change. I think yesterday the going figure was about $4 trillion US dollars a year. Now, where that money is going to come from, everybody seems to be, looking at each other thinking, well, it's not me. And I think the challenge here is the vast majority of this money is going to come from public institutions, i.e. tax money. And this is why Oxfam later this week will be releasing a report around some of the tax policies of different companies. So again, the question is the amount of tax that you're paying relative to where you are? So are you paying taxes where you earn that income? And are you transparent about how that income is generated and the amount that is generated? I gave the example earlier of a extractors company who's, I think the politically correct term is aggressive tax planning, because it's not entirely illegal what they do. But essentially, we have a tax system that extracts value from developing countries and sends it elsewhere. Some of it goes into tax havens, and some of it is just wanders off around the world, but it is not where it needs to be. But unless that money starts flowing in the opposite direction, and quite a lot of this has to come from private institutions and private capital, we're not going to be able to finance the goals. So the more that can be done to ensure that there isn't a financial hurdle for people to engage with the goals and get what they need to engage with the goals, the more likely that we are to achieve these goals. So again, just a little bit on private finance. It's really important to be able to distinguish between what is helpful and what isn't. Quite often there's a mixture of public-private finance, which then tends to confuse people in terms of should that be taxed, should that not be taxed. And just finally, to talk a little bit about the relationship with government and peers, because the SDG, which I think the vast majority of people in this room will affect, is around the SDG on education. Just an example from that is often when the private sector engages on this goal, you'll find that there is a move towards privatizing a lot of either the resources or in fact the delivery of education itself. We find the same thing around healthcare. And yet the SDGs are an expression of rights. It's about education for all. It's about healthcare for all. And so around this, what we would like to see from all actors is a relationship with government that promotes those rights and not a race to the bottom. So rather than companies walking into a country and saying, you need to have tax incentives, you need to lower tax rates, you need to lower wages, you need to remove these trade barriers, or you need to put in these copyright laws, all of these laws and incentives which make it more difficult for people to achieve their goals. We would like to see the private sector use its relationship with government and its influence with government to remove that race to the bottom, and more importantly, work across the sector. So a number of the common issues that keep coming up today, whether it's around pricing, there's a need for a level playing field, and maybe there's something around pre-competitive collaboration amongst peers in order to try and limit some of the issues. So are there issues that we're hearing today that can be taken out of the realm of competition that will enable more people to access information and allow people to have less of a hurdle around accessing information? Is there something maybe about IT services that we could all work on as a pre-competitive factor that will enable that more people to have access to research and publications? So in terms of this, it boils down to we need to have a more systemic way of thinking about the development goals and not cherry pick particular goals, but also to realize that this is more of a marathon than a sprint. While we've got about 13 more years left on the goal, one of the underlying issues that we need to realize is that the problems are widespread, but they're also interconnected. So it's impossible to work on one goal and not the other. And so ultimately, what we're asking of business is to look at, is there a way to change our business models fundamentally so that we are giving more to society than we are extracting out of it? And in that way, we can reach a world without poverty. Thank you very much.